I want to welcome you all to TCU's 5th Annual Native and Indigenous Peoples Day Symposium, and I'm going to start by reading the land acknowledgement. We begin today's session by considering the many relationships we have by being associated with Texas Christian University. TCU's land acknowledgement calls our attention to them, and I ask you to carefully consider them as I read it. As a university, we acknowledge the many benefits we have of being in this place. It is a space we share with all living beings, human and non-human. It is an ancient space where others have lived before us. The monument created jointly by TCU and the Wichita and affiliated tribes reminds us of our benefits, responsibilities, and relationships. We pause to reflect on its words. This ancient land for all our relations. We respectfully acknowledge all Native American peoples who have lived on this land since time immemorial. TCU especially acknowledges and pays respect to the Wichita and affiliated tribes, upon whose historical homeland our university is located. We want to thank TCU's Provost, Teresa Dahlberg, whose office has graciously and generously provided funding that has made Annita Lucchesi's participation in our symposium possible. We are especially honored that she is with us tonight, and I would like to invite her to come and give some opening remarks.
All right, thank you, Haley. It is my honor to welcome everyone to the keynote address for TCU's 5th Annual Native American and Indigenous Peoples Day Symposium. This year's theme, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit People from Awareness to Action, calls our attention to a serious issue facing not only Native American and Indigenous peoples, but also our nation. At TCU, we became aware of this issue in 2018 when speakers discussed MMIW at a workshop on campus. The following year, we established the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Scholarship and included the issue in the 2019 Symposium's Health and Wellness Fair. Many faculty members have incorporated MMIW into their courses, partnering with MMIW Texas. With this year's symposium, we continue our journey from awareness to action. We are honored to feature Annita Lucchesi, one of the most powerful voices for MMIW, as our keynote speaker. Ms. Lucchesi, I extend TCU's warmest welcome. I know you will challenge and move us as we seek to respectfully address this issue. Thank you all for joining this evening.
Thank you so much. And as a recipient of the TCU MMIW Scholarship, I'm so grateful for the work of our provost and the change that we are engaging on our campus. Before I introduce our speaker, let me remind you that after her presentation, we'll have a few minutes for questions. You can also submit those questions for our speaker in the chat box. Also, we recognize that the issues addressed by this year's symposium may be particularly difficult to process, especially for survivors of sexual violence and intimate partner violence. We urge everyone to take advantage of the many counseling and support resources available at TCU and elsewhere. During today's presentation, we will post some of those in the chat box, but we especially want to name Leah Carnahan from the TCU Care Office, who is a confidential resource on campus for survivors. We also encourage you to identify other ways to care for yourself and each other as you process today's conversations. Finally, please do not forget that our symposium programming continues tomorrow night at 6:30 with a virtual American Indian Tribal and Community panel discussion on MMIW G2S. This year's symposium theme is Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit People, from Awareness to Action. We are honored to have with us one of the most powerful voices addressing this issue, Annita Lucchesi. Annita Lucchesi is a researcher and scholar of Cheyenne and Italian descent. She is a PhD student in the School of Geography, Development, Environment at the University of Arizona and is also pursuing a minor in gender and women's studies. She is a graduate scholar in the Native Nations Institute of Collaboration for Indigenous Data Governance and a board member of UA's Gender-Based Violence Consortium. She earned her BA in geography with a minor in global poverty and practice from the University of California, Berkeley, and her MA in American Studies from Washington State University. Annita also serves as a founding executive director of the Sovereign Bodies Institute, a nonprofit research center dedicated to gender and sexual violence against Indigenous peoples. SBI is based in Northern California, but works alongside Indigenous peoples across the US, Canada, and Latin America. Annita has years of experience in academia and higher education, community-based research, cartography, community organizing, and advocacy. Her areas of specialty include violence against Indigenous peoples, femicide, gender and sexual violence, Indigenous cartography and geography, Indigenous data sovereignty, and Indigenous research methodologies. Today's presentation is entitled Data to End Violence Against Indigenous Peoples. Annita, we welcome you to TCU and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for coming tonight. And for those joining via Zoom, thanks for tuning in virtually. It's an honor to be invited and an honor to get to share here. Slides go. Okay. I'm going to try to have tonight's talk not overlap too much with what we talked about this afternoon, because I do see some familiar faces, but I also see a lot of new people. So there's going to be a little bit of overlap, but not too much. Also, housekeeping, I feel like I have to say it. You're going to hear a dry cough. It's not COVID. I've tested negative 5 times this month. I live in a household with 8 kids. They all went back to school in person. Now all of us are sick. It's just a cough. And tonight we're gonna be talking about data to end violence against Indigenous peoples. So kind of more specifically, we'll talk about how research and data gathering can be used to address violence against Indigenous peoples with the mindset that we're kind of, the way I described it earlier this afternoon, time travelers. We have to work backwards to address harms that have taken place in the past. We have to work in the present day to help our people survive what we're going through currently. And we have to look to the future to figure out what our futures can be without this violence. So we're always kind of toggling between those 3 things. And SBI approaches data and research as a way to get there, or as a way to do that. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm a talker, so I will try to get through so that we have a good amount of time for discussion and questions, because I really want to hear from you guys too. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Sovereign Bodies Institute, who we are, kind of the basics of what we do. We'll talk about SBI's research philosophy, which I think is different from really any other research institute or nonprofit. And then we'll also talk about some of the available data and tools that SBI makes available to researchers, to the general public, to tribal communities trying to do their own work to address this issue, and what it means to make that stuff more or less publicly available, while also preserving Indigenous data sovereignty and survivor and family member sovereignty throughout that process, and how it can how that process can be something that's healing, empowering, or mobilizing, rather than something that's extractive or traumatic, which traditionally research has been in Indigenous communities. So about SBI, we are a nonprofit research center focused on gender and sexual violence against Indigenous peoples. We are survivor and family-led. So MMIP is missing and murdered Indigenous people. We kind of switched from MMIW to MMIP in the last maybe 2 years. We typically say MMIWP because we still want to honor that our women are really the foundation of this movement, and also that our women are the center of our circle. while acknowledging that we have people of all genders who are experiencing this violence and this crisis. And so what I mean by survivor and MMIP family led, our staffing, our board, our partners, every decision we make about what projects we take on, who we work with, what the structure of our projects is going to look like, all takes family and survivor leadership into account. And so myself as executive director, I'm a survivor of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and trafficking. I also have 4 MMIW cases in my family, 3 of which are unsolved with no conviction. So that's kind of my personal connection to this work, but all of our staff have our own personal connections. And most of us are a mix of both survivor and family member. And the other thing I'll say about that is we also are, I think, the only organization that I know of that's led by a leadership council made up entirely of Indigenous women, survivors of trafficking and survival sex work. We have women on that council from both the US and Canada. We have Two-Spirit and trans women represented on that council, women of all different ages, all different tribes. It's one of the most diverse spaces I've ever participated in as one of the 9 women. And it's part of our commitment to ensure that our organization and our work is led by people who are experiencing that violence firsthand, and thus are the true experts on the crisis, but also that we're going to be a role model to other organizations and other efforts to address this crisis so that they can see it's not just a matter of, having a token gathering where, you might consult once and then never build that relationship over time. It's about making a commitment to having your leadership reflect the people that you're serving, so that at all times our people feel represented in our staff and our leadership. We are the home of the MMIW database, and that's kind of how Sovereign Bodies Institute got started. That's something that people ask me is kind of like, how did all this come about? And the answer is a giant accident. It was not something there was no morning where I woke up and said, I'm going to build a database today. I had no experience in data science. That was not, I came into the field of Indigenous data sovereignty through this work. So I didn't have a background in it. I had never built a database before. And honestly was pretty naive in the beginning, thinking that it would have a start and an end, and that I could gather all these names and news articles and come up with a number that way and a list that way, and that I would be done and could move on to the next project. That was 6 years ago, and now it's become my life's work. And so, I think there's a lot of students in this room, and so I would encourage all of you, no matter what your passion is, be open to the path that Creator puts you on, because that was not the path that I had chosen for myself. But it was something that once I started, I couldn't turn away from. And I never thought that I would be the person to do it. But now I can't see myself doing anything else. And that happened by accident in a Panera because I couldn't afford Wi-Fi at home. That's the story of SBI. So the database now, we have almost 5,000 cases across the US and Canada documented. Adding more every day, not just new cases, but working backwards to try to identify historic or previous cases. The database initially included women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, and extended across the US and Canada. In 2018, we launched a sister database for our relatives throughout Latin America as well. This last year, we launched a kind of independent database for Two-Spirit and LGBTQ victims as well. And all 3 of those databases kind of speak to each other. They all use the same format, but the idea is also that they each have their home. And in terms of kind of how we determine which case goes in which data, it's based on geography. So we honor indigeneity in all of its forms, no matter where someone comes from. So for example, we have a family we work with in California, and they're Tarahumara, which is a tribe in Mexico, but their loved one was murdered in California. So she's in the US data, and vice versa. We have a First Nations woman from Canada who was murdered in the Dominican Republic, and she's in the Latin America data. So we try to, that's kind of our decision-making process in terms of which database is the home for that story. Outside of our work on the database, in general, our goal is development of data-driven best practices through research, advocacy, and direct services to families and survivors. And I'll talk more about that when we talk about our research philosophy, but in general, what that looks like is a mix of partnerships with tribal nations and Indigenous-led organizations, grassroots Indigenous organizers and community leaders, and then a lot of direct work with impacted families. It's really the families that have been at the forefront of this movement. And even though awareness is just kind of now in the last couple of years building in the US, there's been a really thriving MMIW movement in Canada for decades. One thing that I like to remind people is that the first official MMIW march in Canada was February 1991, and I was born in May 1991. So there's never been a time in my lifetime where the MMIW movement didn't exist, which I think is, you know, it can be haunting and depressing, but it's also kind of beautiful to think that there's never been a time in my life where there weren't women fighting for my right to exist and my right to live a life free from violence. And that makes me feel pretty cared for and special. So that's kind of SBI in a nutshell. We are geographically distributed all over. Our main office is in Northern California. We just opened up a new office in Billings, Montana. That's the office that I work out of because my tribe is 2 hours to the east. I'm Cheyenne. And we have staff all over. So we have some staff that work in those two offices, but we also have a TCU alum working for us who leads our services program, and she works from her reservation in New York. And we have staff and board members in Canada as well. So we're always kind of expanding outwards. And one of the core beliefs for us is that colonial borders should never define our work, whether that's like a geographic border or a colonial definition of gender or a colonial definition of indigeneity. It really has no business defining how we take care of our people and how we work to address violence, knowing that all of those borders are actually forms of violence in and of themselves. So as far as I know, we're the only organization that provides direct services to MMIP families in both countries. We also provide services in Spanish to our relatives in Latin America as well, and have a 24/7 crisis line available via phone and text in both languages. This is a sample of some of our publications and events that we've taken on. This is a flyer from a vigil we did last year. This is my adopted sister, Allison Highwolf, who was murdered 6 years ago. And a screenshot from, we have a weekly healing circle for families and survivors. We ship them free beading supplies and free weaving supplies, and have teachers who are also family members or survivors come in and teach classes and teach different activities. Like I think pretty soon we're going to start moccasin making, which I'm super excited about. We also have, kind of in addition to the services and direct work with families, a number of publications. They're all available free for download on our website. Our two kind of regional focuses have been Northern California and Southeast Montana, but we do work nationally and internationally. There's been a lot of interest in the relationship between MMIW and extractive industries. And before the Keystone XL pipeline was officially canceled, we issued a report. Basically, kind of, it was a challenge for us because I think no one, at least as far as we knew, was trying to do a study on the impact of the pipeline before it was built. Oftentimes those studies are kind of after the fact. And our work was very much focused on preventing the pipeline from being built in the first place. And so this study was an experiment for us to kind of think through, like, how do we study violence before it happens? The answer for us was looking at kind of the existing landscape of MMIW and sexual violence against Indigenous peoples across the Northern Plains. This graphic here represents our missing, our murdered, and our survivors, which is why only the survivors have their face shown. but this was actually used as evidence in court hearings to fight the Keystone XL pipeline. So that was pretty neat that families and survivors ourselves, some of us who come from tribes impacted by that pipeline, gathered the data, wrote up the report, and entered it in as evidence. And then, another regional example is our work in Northern California. The other publication I really want to draw your attention to is our organizing toolkit. Anybody who's here who wants to get involved, that's a great place to start. We have people ask us all the time, what can I do? And it's different for every person. Everybody has a different capacity, different passions, different skills. And so the toolkit is meant to kind of be a place to start. There's chapters on kind of boots on the ground work, community healing, media, policy, data. No matter what you're kind of drawn to, there's a chapter, and it's meant to be really interactive. There's worksheets, activity guides, quizzes. It's less about us telling you what to do and more about you giving the tools to figure out what you can contribute and what your community needs from you. Which, we're not in every community across the entire country, so we can't tell you, but your own community can. So that's the purpose of the toolkit. There's also some really great small chapters written by families and survivors that, if you're wanting to learn more directly from those impacted, is a great place to start. So that gives you a sample of kind of some of the work we do. These photos here are, we're really blessed to partner with CONAMI, which is an Indigenous women's network across Mexico that works to address violence against Indigenous women. They have their own MMIW database for Mexico that we've partnered with them to support and share ideas and methods across with each other. And they also brought us into ECMIA, which is the Intercontinental Congress of Indigenous Women. There are very few organizations from the US that are invited to participate. So it really is an honor to get to participate in those spaces. And the photo up top is at the end of a workshop that we led at the most recent ECMIA last year, just before COVID hit. Actually working with groups from across Latin America to teach them how we gather our data and how we store it, how we care for it, so that they can do that in their own countries too. And I should mention our data. We'll go through our data sharing protocols, but we do make it available upon request. So we also, let them know, like, hey, we have data on women in your country, and I'm sure it's not thorough. I'm sure there's cases we don't know about, especially in Latin America because it's so underreported. But it was really about building that kind of system of kinship and diplomacy, again, across those colonial borders, to unite Indigenous women throughout the Americas in addressing femicide. So this is kind of a sampling of the things we do. It's a mix of relationship building, research, direct work with families, services provision. We kind of have to be everything all at once because there's so little available to our people, especially on a national or international scale. These are kind of the 5 core main principles of our research philosophy. The first is that research is an Indigenous ancestral practice. There is nothing colonial or white about research. Europeans don't get to monopolize research. The way I describe it is like my auntie, who's like a gossip and she knows everybody's business, like as it's happening in real time. She is a researcher. Gossip is the original research. And beyond that, we've always, fundamentally, research is a practice of gathering information about our peoples, our homelands, our practices, how we relate to one another, what's going on in our community, what's going on in our bodies. That's something we've always done as Indigenous people. So there's nothing new about that for us. It's just about figuring out how to incorporate those ancestral practices and value systems to address a crisis that wasn't present when our ancestors were living, 600 years ago. And so there wasn't a method to study femicide 600 years ago because it wasn't happening. So we do have to create, new ways of addressing it, but we can lean on that ancestral tradition and those practices and teachings. The second value is families and survivors are the experts. We believe in that really strongly. As I mentioned, we have our Survivors Leadership Council. Our staff boarded partners are largely families and survivors, but beyond that, even in in the way we structure our projects and our partnerships, everything is with families and survivors at the forefront. So I was actually talking about that this afternoon. Annette and I were having a conversation about sometimes we contract with tribes or Indigenous organizations to partner with them on research or partner with them on kind of community-based projects. And it's actually in our contract that the families own the data. SBI doesn't own it, the partner agency doesn't own it. We care for it on the family's behalf, but ultimately it's their decision what's shared and what's not. And we've actually turned partnerships down. For example, there was a tribe who they wanted full access to all of our client case files for not just their own tribal members, but all Native people living within the geographic scope of the project. And our response was, we will make available to you what the families allow us to make available to you. Ultimately, it's not best, like you wouldn't ask a domestic violence shelter to share all of their client case files with the tribal government. It's just not best practice. We don't even, not even our full staff sees those client case files. If you're not on the services team and you're not working with that client, you don't have access. But they insisted on that level of access regardless of family consent. So we said no, and we walked away from that partnership. We believe very strongly that families and survivors should have full autonomy and full power throughout the process, should be empowered to take leadership throughout the process. For example, another one of our rules is we don't get involved in any media projects unless it's family or survivor led. And in the context of a film, that means the director or the producer needs to be a family or survivor, not just, interviewed, needs to be a producer or director with creative authority. And the project really should have an advisory board that's comprised of families and survivors. That's something, again, that we require. Our third value is that efforts to end violence against Indigenous peoples must be rooted in tribal sovereignty and Indigenous self-determination. This one, I feel like it goes without saying when you're talking to Native people, because it's kind of a given that, violence against our people comes from colonialism. But for those that haven't worked with Indigenous communities, maybe that connection isn't immediately apparent, but we didn't have an MMIW problem prior to colonization. I don't want to say that our societies were perfect because they weren't, we're humans. And we did have cases of violence against women, but they were a lot less frequent, rarely led to something like, murder, and they were dealt with swiftly and appropriately by our own tribal justice systems. That's something that we're not allowed to do today because we live under ongoing colonial occupation, illegal occupation. That's a violation of international law. And that those violations of international law are the reason that this violence happens and is allowed to continue. Whether it's not holding perpetrators accountable because government, US law enforcement agencies are negligent and racist, or if, just the existing policy system, the way it's set up, is really targets Native women and Native queer folks for violence. And so if we're working to address violence, it doesn't make sense to not center tribal sovereignty and Indigenous self-determination in everything we do, which is why we don't allow government agencies to access any of our data ever. We'll give them statistics like aggregate numbers. We will never give them raw data. The FBI has asked for our database several times, as has the Department of Justice, and nothing is funnier than telling the FBI no. And we've done that several times. We're not going to do it. We don't have to. We're sovereign peoples, and this data isn't for them. This data is for our tribal nations and for our people to take care of ourselves and to empower ourselves to protect each other, to heal each other, and to create new circles of safety and systems of accountability. So yeah, that's kind of our philosophy on self-determination. The fourth is that good research is research that heals, empowers, and mobilizes. If it doesn't do one of those three things, it's a waste of our time. Our people are dying every day, not just from the MMIP crisis, but from very preventable deaths. Things like, my sister-in-law this past summer was in her 30s and died of a stroke. That could have been prevented if she had access to better medical care. Or my best friend's cousin was attacked at a party, had a head injury, went to the IHS clinic for treatment. And because they don't have an MRI machine or a CAT scan machine, they told her, well, we're gonna give you some aspirin, and if it still hurts 2 weeks from now, come back. And she left and she died of a brain hemorrhage. And that was a completely preventable death, completely preventable MMIW death. And not only, was she not given proper medical care, our tribe we're policed by Bureau of Indian Affairs. We haven't had a criminal investigator in over a year. So there's a whole stack of murders that now includes hers that are not being investigated because there's literally no one to do it. And unfortunately, that woman's mother died of a broken heart a few weeks ago. Her heart just gave out, she fainted. And so that's what's at stake in this research. If we're not working to heal, empower, or mobilize, it is a waste of our time because our people are dying and we cannot do anything less than one of these three things. And so if it's not doing that specifically for Indigenous people, if it doesn't heal us, if it doesn't empower our people, if it doesn't mobilize our people, then we got things to do. And it's just not worth our attention. The last kind of core value is our research is stronger when our people are strong and their needs are met. And that's how our services program came to be. We initially started out as just a research institute, and it became clear almost immediately that there's a lot of acute needs that Indigenous survivors and MMIP families have that largely go unaddressed. And especially MMIP families, because up until last year, there was no federal funding for it. So any kind of tribal victim services programming just like literally wasn't allowed to spend their money on that. It wasn't within their scope of work. Their staff couldn't even like have a meeting about it. And so that's starting to change a little bit now that, there's more awareness building and we have policymakers that are starting to listen, but there's still a lot of acute needs. And so we decided that if we're really going to commit to doing research from an Indigenous perspective, that means doing research that takes care of our people and responds to their needs. In my own tribe, we have a teaching that says that the true definition of a leader is the poorest person in the community because they give everything they have to their people. And that's a value that we try to live by every day in our work. Even, myself personally, in my role as executive director, I lead the organization, but I'm also our primary advocate for all of our Montana clients, which is at this point almost 100. And almost, I think we're at 47 just from Billings area, Crow and Northern Cheyenne, which is the area where I live. And I also do all of the kind of case advocacy with law enforcement, medical examiners, and the justice system on all of the hundreds of cases we work on across the continent. Because I didn't want my role as, somebody in leadership of the organization to take me away from the reality and the day-to-day needs of the families that we serve and the survivors. So that's kind of how we structured my position. And it means that I'm able to lead our research staff and lead our research projects because I know the needs and priorities of the families and survivors we work with. And I know these cases inside and out better than anybody because I have to go to bat with law enforcement every day. And I'm sitting in these families' homes, I'm driving around all over multiple reservations. And that's the reality of our work. Our work would be nothing if we didn't do that. And so I can talk more about the services we provide later in the presentation, but we try to be as holistic as possible and really meet folks where they're at. And it does make our research stronger. Our data and our database is stronger because we have cases that we wouldn't have known about any other way, but families came to us for help and we were able to say, hey, do you want your loved one in this data? And they said yes. It also means that our data is more robust. Even cases that we do know about, there's a lot of information that we document that the media is not going to report on, that law enforcement don't track, that you wouldn't know if you didn't have a relationship with that family, especially like connections between multiple victims, if they were extended relatives or their name in their tribal language, how many kids they have. A lot of our clients, not only do I know how many kids they have, I know their kids' names. I know what we got them for their school supplies this summer. And they call me Auntie because that's the nature of this work. And it does make our research stronger. It means that whenever we're making a decision about what project we're going to take on, what's important to us, we're always keeping their needs in mind. And it means when it's time for us to do surveys or interviews, we always have a bunch of people lined up ready to share because they trust us and they feel safe with us. And they know that we're going to use their story for something meaningful. So I wanted to go a little bit into the database as a whole, just to give you some examples of the kind of data we track and also how it's used. This is a very brief summary of what we collect. It's already outdated. One thing I'm really proud of about the database is that we track whatever the community tells us to track, which means we're adding new categories constantly. When people say, it'd be really great if you had this, or it'd be awesome if you had that, we always add those categories, which means the database is always a work in progress, because whenever we add a new category, we have to go back for the 5,000 cases already documented and try to find that information. So it's kind of, my dad makes a joke about, like, you know, the guy that's always pushing the rock up the mountain. It's kind of like that, because you get to the top and you think it's complete, and then somebody adds a new category and you have to start over. But what it means to me is that this database really reflects the intellectual brilliance of Indian country, that we're able to document the things that are important to Indian country as a whole, and that this research reflects all of the kind of, you know, thoughtful ideas that our people have, and that it feels like something they own, that it's not something that just belongs to SBI. It's something that they have ownership over, that they can say, like, hey, it needs that, or why aren't you documenting this? Like, that people feel comfortable to say that means that they're part owner in it too, and that they're invested in it. And that really means a lot to us. In terms of how the data is used, we have a couple examples here. Our board member, Theda Newbreast, has a sign that she updates with the names from all the women in the Blackfoot Confederacy. There's 1 band in Montana and 3 bands in Canada. And she takes it to different events and does kind of, she's an elder, she does healing work with the families there. We mentor teen girls. This is the Box Elder girls basketball team from a few years ago. They went all the way to the state championships and won when they played for MMIW. So they had red laces in their shoes. They did MMIW honorings at every game. And they actually created a whole podcast about MMIW in Montana. And we kind of supported them through that. But they won state championship twice, both seasons that they played for MMIW. This picture is kind of a composite estimate about what a Jane Doe looks like based on her skull features. And it is rare, but there has been a couple of times where we've been able to help identify Jane Does based on the database. Medical examiners will reach out to us and say, you know, hey, we're looking for a woman age 30 to 40. She grew up in New Mexico and was found in Illinois in 1987 and had at least 1 child. And we can kind of work backwards with that information to see if there's anything that matches in our data. There's never been an instance where it's like, oh, we know for sure it's that person. I wish it were like that, but typically there's 3 to 4 possible matches, and we send all of those to them. And then they're able to kind of winnow it down from there by reaching out to families for DNA samples and things like that. But we have worked on Jane Doe cases. We also make the data available to Indigenous researchers for their own projects, whether it's, you know, undergrad or grad, or faculty members for that matter. We make the data available to tribes and to MMIW and anti-violence organizations so that they can use the data to shape their work. Where I think it's really important is, like, tribal domestic violence programs will ask for all of the data of women in their state or women in their tribe, and we can provide that to them, and it'll show the dynamics specific to their area of what percentage are related to intimate partner violence, what percentage are under age 20, or things like that. And it helps them design interventions that are specific to their community. That kind of, like, specificity is never going to be available in government or law enforcement data, because they don't track tribal affiliation. The National Missing Persons Database last year added a category for victim tribal affiliation, but law enforcement never put anything in it. Like you could go online and look at the cases that are available to the public. Very few of them have tribal affiliation listed. So this kind of data, I think, is especially critical for tribes and Indigenous anti-violence organizations who are trying to work on both the prevention side of things and on services for families and survivors to really get a sense of what's going on in their local community. I just have a link to the PDF for our data sharing protocols. It is available on our website. If you go to data and then access, or can you click on it?
No.
Okay,
I was not
that's
sure.
fine. If any of you are interested in accessing the data, like I said, we make it available to Indigenous researchers, Indigenous-led media projects, only aggregate stats for media, not raw data, tribal nations, grassroots MMIW activists, if they're Indigenous and they have a proven track record working with families. Examples of people we don't give data to, non-native researchers, nope, media, no, government agencies, no, and any organization with an abuser in leadership. Those are automatic no's. And for researchers who are trying to access the data, we do require that you get IRB approval in advance, even if you're an undergrad. So oftentimes researchers will reach out to us and be like, I'm writing a paper and I need it next week. And no. We do expect you to go through ethics review at whatever institution you're at. And also your application for academic use of the data has to be approved by our own board. And they meet twice a year. So it's very likely that you could wait 6 to 8 months for academic use of the data. But that's kind of on purpose. We want it to be hard because we want it to only be pursued by people who really have a thoughtful, intentional plan about how they're going to use it and have the time to get to know it and use it respectfully. And if you're not invested in that kind of long process and thinking in advance, being really intentional, we can't trust you with this data anyway. So that's how I structure those protocols, which again are available on our website. Just a few examples of some of the research tools that we make available that are available to the public. We designed a model for community needs assessments, and this is available in our Northern California reports. These are screenshots from our code book. So raise your hand if you know what a code book is. Okay, so most of you don't, that's okay. A code book is essentially like, if you're going to do interviews with research subjects, and let's say you're going to record those interviews, you would go through the transcripts and you would highlight or take notes on the places where they talked about certain themes. So we came up with a whole list of themes that's like 3 or 4 pages long and color coded them for you so that if you were to do an MMIW project in your own community, you don't have to start from scratch. Those themes are already listed out based on our own experience as grassroots researchers, as well as based on what we've seen in the existing literature on MMIW from kind of a scholarly point of view. So we make that available. We also have needs assessment interview questions that are kind of a standard template that you can deviate from as necessary, but they're a place to start. And then we have templates for individual case files. So a case file cover sheet, a contact log template, a research log template. Since then, we've also created a services log template just to ensure that every time that you're meeting with a family member or a survivor or you're researching a case, all of that stuff is in one central location. And you're asking all the right questions based on our experience as both researchers and service providers. And all of this is available publicly. The intent of distributing it publicly is because we want people to take on projects like this, but we want people to do it in a good way with the right level of intention and care and with the right resources to do it well. So that's why we've created these resources and made them available. I know we talked about the organizing toolkit. This is another kind of summary of it. what's relevant in terms of research methods. We have a worksheet on determining what data you need, a quiz on proper use and care for your data based on what kind of data you're using, what kind of safety protocols or provisions should be there, what your storage plan should look like, things like that. We also have regional data infographics with information by state and region. So this is an example of the Southwest region. You can see as of last year, Texas had 33 cases. We have a bibliography with academic resources. So you never have to start from scratch if you're writing an MMIW paper or a paper on violence against Indigenous people, because we have like a 20-page bibliography available. We also have a whole list of missing persons databases by state and province for both the US and Canada with the link to their publicly accessible URLs. You can search those. And again, chapters on best practices and data policy, boots on the ground work, support services, media, community healing, any possible entry point. I promise you there's a chapter for you in the organizing toolkit. So if you have an interest leaving this room and want to learn more, please do start there. We also, as I mentioned, take on a number of community and tribal partnerships. So right now, for example, we have a partnership with the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, which is based in Southern California, to do a regional study on MMIW throughout Southern California. We also take on community partnerships with Indigenous-led organizations. Like this past year, we took on a partnership with the California Rural Indian Health Board to do a study on COVID's impact with intimate partner violence and MMIW across California. And then we also have a program that's personally one of my favorite things. It's our leading community researchers. And these are all our current leading community researchers who are just now wrapping up their projects. But the idea for it is that taking on a research project requires a lot of resources and a lot of help. And oftentimes Indigenous community members don't have that. And don't have the institutional leverage that comes from being affiliated with the university. So we decided to circumnavigate that by providing those resources for ourselves. So the Lcr program are Indigenous folks who have a great idea to address gender or sexual violence in their communities, but lack the financial support, lack the institutional support that would come from being affiliated with the university. So we provide them with a stipend that covers their time so that they're able to dedicate their time to this work, as well as cover the costs of their project. We provide them with hours from our research assistants so that they have support, mentorship from our staff, and then they write up proposals that go through an ethics review from our own board, so that they're not having to do things on their own, that their projects are being done in a good way and in a culturally relevant way. I can't tell you how many times I've gone through the ethic review process for my own graduate research, and it's a room full of white people that don't understand anything about tribal communities, and they're trying to be sensitive, they're trying to be thoughtful about the extra protections that should be there, but ultimately they're there to cover the institution, not to cover me or my community, and protect the institution from lawsuit. And so they come at it with a very different perspective. For example, I've done research with Indigenous sex workers, and you could imagine the panic in that room with a bunch of middle-aged white researchers who are you're doing research with people who are actively perpetrating crimes and experiencing violence, and wait, you're you knew some of them when you were on the streets, wait, you're related to some of them. The layers of panic that came up over time was it's so it's really hard to get support to do research like that within the academy, which is why we want to support community-based researchers in doing it themselves. So to give you a sense of some of the projects that they've taken on, Elizabeth Skye is Lakota, and she's done a project on pottery as an Indigenous form of data visualization by working with our data on Indigenous Jane Does, and creating pottery that represents that data. Britt Reed is working with, she's Choctaw, and she's working with a number of other Choctaw folks to do a podcast on revitalization of traditional Choctaw tattoos as a form of violence prevention and body sovereignty. Melissa Shouting is Blackfoot from Alberta, and she's doing a project on developing a model for culturally specific empowerment centers for Indigenous women and girls on the streets. She works in public health and has years of experience working with unsheltered Native women. And so that was kind of her calling. So she's creating a Blackfoot specific example with elders from her community, but also documenting the process of how they created that example so that folks from other tribes can use that as a starting point too. We have Lucia, and this is Eladia Superman. She's the first Indigenous woman member of Congress in Peru. They collaborated together to create a healing center for Indigenous women who have been forcibly sterilized by the Peruvian government. And we supported the center, and in exchange, they've put together a publication kind of documenting how they went about building the center, the things that they offer, stuff like that, so that Indigenous communities elsewhere who have also experienced forcible sterilization, which did happen here in the US, still happens here in the US, but Oklahoma was a big epicenter of it, have resources to start creating healing centers as well. And then the last example, Lorelei Williams, she created a dance group called Butterflies in Spirit in British Columbia. And they're all survivors or MMIW family members. And they dance as a form of healing and as a form of community awareness. So they're creating a toolkit on dance as healing for families and survivors, and actually creating video tutorials to learn some of their dances that are contemporary, but take inspiration from traditional dances. So you can see all of them are drastically different and addressing violence through a variety of mediums and different kind of entry points. But the idea is to do a project that wouldn't necessarily be supported by an academic institution, is of value to their own tribal community, and also is a model that could be taken up by tribal communities elsewhere. And that's how we kind of invest in them. And again, how we invest in community-based and survivor and family-led research. And I will close out there. I'm so proud of myself, I got through it on time. So we have time for questions. This is some of our contact information. As I mentioned, we do have a 24/7 crisis line, and we do work with Indigenous folks in the full spectrum and beauty of indigeneity. We don't require any proof of tribal enrollment. If you self-identify as Indigenous, we'll support you. We also work with all genders, all forms of violence, including police violence, violence in custody if you're incarcerated. We actually have clients who are incarcerated and we work with them from prison. We really try to be as holistic as possible, and our services, the only things we don't provide are medical attention and legal representation, because we're not doctors or lawyers. But everything else we will do, and if you need a doctor or lawyer, we will make a referral to an appropriate one. So there's very few times where I think we've ever had to tell a client, we just can't help you. We really try to go above and beyond for folks. And also on this slide, you have contact information for me personally, our website, and then also how to file a data request. So please do reach out. Like I said, we're here for the community. We're here to support people, whether you're Indigenous or not, doing something to address this crisis. I firmly believe it's going to take all of us to address this crisis, and it shouldn't be Native women on our own. Ultimately, over 90% of perpetrators are men. So this is a men's issue. And also this is a non-Native issue because over half the perpetrators are non-Native. And this is a public safety issue that addresses, or that, that everyone has a stake in. There's no place in this country that hasn't been affected by this crisis. So it really does affect all of us, whether you realize it or not. So thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for letting me share about our work, and I'd love to answer questions.
Can you talk about the maybe unique situation Texas plays in some of the trafficking and concerns about, I kind of hear sometimes that people call down to Texas to keep an eye out for some women that are missing. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, I wish Jody were here because I feel like she could answer that so much better than me. What I'll say is that Texas has a reputation for having a high number of trafficking cases, native and non-native. And I think a big part of it is the interstates, and that there's so much trucking traffic that comes through Texas, and those truckers play a really big part in it. I see that in our community in Montana too, because we also have a trucking route for our reservation. And they really know to prey on our women, whether it's parking at our casino at night to solicit, or sometimes they hit Native women for fun and leave them there by the side of the road, and they die. So that's kind of like I was taught to always stay away from truckers and stay away from gas stations where truckers frequent for that reason. I'm sorry, I don't have a more detailed answer to that question. Any other questions?
Yes, may I ask, what is like a two-spirit person, like you referred to?
Good question. Two-spirit is a contemporary Native word for some people. People have different definitions. Some people interpret it as a Native word for a non-binary person, and others interpret it as a word for anybody on the LGBTQ spectrum. Yeah, I would say it's complicated. There's some Native people that I know define it one way, some that define it another way. And it's important to know that it is a culturally specific term, so it's not for non-Native folks. And it's also, there's a lot of Native queer folks who don't identify with that word because they identify with the word from their own tribe or their tribal language. And in general, like I can't speak for every tribe, but it's definitely my experience that the majority of tribes that I know of not only embraced queer folks, but like held them as sacred, and that they had special roles and responsibilities in our communities. And I do see our generation especially reclaiming those roles more and more, but it's definitely still a work in progress. Yes. Right here.
Thanks for this amazing presentation. I was wondering if you also work with forced migration and displacement issues, because a lot of crisis conditions that we just explained, trafficking and abduction, sort of are aligned to the phenomena of forced migration and displacement. So do you also work in those areas as well?
Yes, I would say maybe tangentially. For example, some of our clients who experience really severe violence on their reservations, or even MMIW families, end up having to leave their communities because they don't feel safe. And that becomes kind of a forced displacement. But if we're talking specifically about like folks who come from outside the US who have been displaced or forced to migrate for survival, we do work with people like that. That's why we started offering services in Spanish. Is because especially, with our office being in California, there's a really large migrant population in California, and a lot of them are Indigenous, and a lot of them don't even speak Spanish, and their primary language is their Indigenous language. And in those cases, we had one case like that where the woman only spoke her Maya dialect, and we were able to find a translator who could work with our Spanish-speaking advocate to translate across from Maya to Spanish and back and forth. But unfortunately, there's some Indigenous languages where we don't know a translator, like Central California has a really large Zapotec community. And I don't know somebody who speaks that. So it is something that is on our mind. And we do have clients that come to us because they weren't safe in their home country or they weren't supported, and have migrated here. But have come here and maybe experience further violence, or lack of support. We do work with clients who are undocumented, and try to provide them as much resources as possible on how to be safe in a way that feels comfortable to them. Yes.
Have you all had the opportunity to do any partnership work with Canadian entities about like identification of bodies from the schools that they've been discovering?
Yes and no. There's a really amazing Northern Cheyenne researcher from here in the States. Her name is Marcia Small. And her dissertation research is on that. She uses GPR, ground penetrating radar. It kind of looks like a lawnmower. And she's working at Chemawa Indian School, which is in Oregon, and working in the graveyard there to try to identify. At this point, it's challenging, verging on impossible to identify students by their names. But at this point, her work is focused on mapping those mass graves and figuring out how many bodies are actually in them. Repatriating them and figuring out who belongs to which tribe is another story. So we do have a good relationship with Marcia. In terms of in Canada, we haven't worked with folks up there. We did attend, like one of these slides had a picture kind of in the bottom corner of us with the ladies from Konami. That was actually at a university in Canada that started out as a boarding school and now it's a college. And we didn't know it was a boarding school until we got there, neither did the ladies from Mexico. And it was really traumatic because Mexico also had a boarding school system for Indigenous kids. We were able to get through it with some of our cultural practices, but they do have a graveyard there. The school has like a graveyard for all the nuns and the priests. And then there's a big rock wall that they made the students build that separates that from the mass grave for the kids. And there's over 100 kids buried in that cemetery. But that school, they worked really hard to identify as many of the kids buried there as possible. And they do have an Indigenous woman survivor of the school as the caretaker in that cemetery.
We have several questions online, so I'll read one of those, or a few that I'll maybe synthesize. So a couple of people have asked different variations of a question about so if crimes are if violence is being carried out primarily or even substantially by folks who are not part of sovereign nations or tribal communities, wouldn't sharing data with outside entities help to solve those crimes, and why in your experience is that not always the case, we'll say?
Over half of the cases we have documented where we know who the perpetrator was are non-native. That said, the vast majority of cases in our database have no perpetrator identified because police never got that far. So that says something in and of itself, that most cases are not investigated even that far. The second part to that question, if providing data would, make the investigations better, no, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think law enforcement need access to data like that in order to do their job. Like, if they can't do their job without it, then they shouldn't be law enforcement. Presumably, if they're on the force, that means they've graduated the academy and passed their certification and have been deemed competent to be a cop. So that's how I feel about that. I'll also say that the majority of cases that I've worked on as like an advocate directly with law enforcement have systemic issues of neglect. And it's not because law enforcement don't know about the issue, it's because they don't care. And like trying to think of how I can give an example without giving like confidential case information. I've seen evidence missing from the evidence locker. I have seen evidence never cataloged properly. I've seen phones from crime scenes sitting there collecting dust for over 5 years that have never been searched. I've seen autopsies that were done negligently or incorrectly. It's stuff that, like, I'm not a cop, but I know you should probably search a phone you found in a murder scene within 5 years. Or I'm not a medical examiner, but I know that, if a woman had a brain hemorrhage and bruises all over her, you should probably be able to rule out domestic violence before saying that it wasn't a homicide. Things like that, that are just, again, it's negligence and it's laziness. It's not a lack of knowledge. And especially in places like Montana that has a very high Native population, from what I've seen, I mean, we have multiple murders a year. right? Like I said, our small community, which is pretty rural, has over 50 cases that SBI works on, and there's more that we don't. Families we haven't had a chance to meet yet, or who aren't ready for that yet. And so like Montana only has 2 medical examiners offices in the whole state, which means every single one of those victims goes through one out of those 2 offices. And that medical examiner might be in that position for 15, 20 years. And same with like our sheriffs. Usually a sheriff is in their position for at least 10 years, if not longer. They know because they're the ones wheeling the bodies out of the room. And they're the ones investigating these cases. So they know the dynamics, they know how often it happens, and they still do nothing. So I don't think data access would change that.
Question and follow up a little bit on that. Can you explain a little bit about jurisdictions?
Sure, I mean, that's a whole college class.
Okay. Is there like a Cliff Notes here or there kind of thing?
Yeah, so jurisdiction, is there a pen here?
Yes.
Great, okay, so you have several pieces of legislation that kind of shape jurisdiction in a new country. The first one is the Major Crimes Act. And the Major Crimes Act dictates that any major crime that happens on an Indian reservation is federal jurisdiction. So trafficking, murder, sexual assault, anything like that is automatically federal jurisdiction, regardless of the race of the perpetrator or what the circumstances were. The only exception to that is PL 280 or VAWA, which is the Violence Against Women Act, specifically the 2013 reauthorization. So PL 280, Public Law 280, was a program that required some states are mandatory PL 280 states. I believe there's 8 of them, where county sheriffs, the state has jurisdiction over a reservation, not the feds. So examples of that would be California, Alaska, and there's also, so there's PL 280 states, but there's also PL 280 tribes. So for example, Montana is not a PL 280 state, but there's one PL 280 tribe in Montana, that's Salish and Kootenai. So there's 8 federally recognized tribes in Montana. Only one of them is PL 280, which means it's policed by the county sheriff. The rest are a mix of tribal law enforcement, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the FBI. The Violence Against Women Act, the 2013 reauthorization, restored criminal jurisdiction over non-native offenders, specifically only intimate partner violence. So the conditions to actually exercise that jurisdiction, first, you have to be a tribe that's approved by Congress to exercise that jurisdiction, which means that you have the kind of basic requirements are that you have to have your own jail, or you have to have a county jail that's willing to take your offenders. If you don't, it's a non-starter. Also, you have to have a tribal court that has congressional approval, which means Congress has decided that your court is professional enough that they're not going to practice undue prejudice against a non-native offender because they're non-native. So first, you have to have that congressional approval. And then second, the case has to be IPV. So what that means is the victim has to have a long-term relationship with the perpetrator. It must be intimate partner violence. So for example, if a husband or if a father beat up his kids, doesn't count. Child abuse isn't covered by this. And it cannot be sexual assault. It has to be physical assault. So while it was a great kind of, yeah, I mean, theoretically sexual assault, if they charged the perpetrator for intimate partner for domestic violence under VAWA, like, yeah, if you considered sexual assault under that umbrella, there might be a way to exercise that. But it doesn't include, like, if you got sexually assaulted by a teacher or a random guy pulled over and picked you up off the highway, or like, it wouldn't include anything like that. and doesn't include child abuse. It also does not include trafficking. Also, after all of that, the maximum sentence that any tribal court can give to any offender is 1 year.
Wow.
So if you want an offender to do more significant time than that, you have to pursue federal or state charges, depending on what jurisdiction you're in. The next piece is a Supreme Court case called Oliphant v. Suquamish. This was in 1978 and had nothing to do with MMIW or anything like that. But this was the Supreme Court case that decided that tribes don't have criminal jurisdiction over non-natives. So if a non-native person perpetrates a crime, even if it's with, outside the Major Crimes Act, they don't have jurisdiction, only over Native people. And specifically over someone who's an enrolled tribal member of a federally recognized tribe. So all of these kind of come together to really cripple tribal nations from effectively policing their communities. There is a proposed reauthorization of VAWA that extends this jurisdiction to child abuse, violence against tribal police, trafficking, and sexual assault, but it hasn't passed. And Republicans have really opposed it under the basis that, again, tribal courts can't be trusted to treat non-native people without prejudice, which is laughable because any federal or state court pretty much always treats a native person with prejudice and never has native people on the jury. And their concern is that there's no white people on a tribal court jury. So that's kind of the double standard there. That's jurisdiction in any country in a nutshell. Again, so the circumstances are, what state are you in? What was the crime? Who was the perpetrator? What tribe are you working with? There's the last piece is TLOA, the Tribal Law and Order Act. Under TLOA, tribes that were previously under Appeal 280 can appeal to restore federal jurisdiction. So for example, the Hoopa Valley tribe in Northern California under TLOA shifted from Humboldt County criminal jurisdiction to federal jurisdiction once again. But it's, a different colonial uniform. All of this said, as complicated as this is, I went over it in like 5 minutes and didn't, I took Indian Law 101, I did not go to law school. If I can figure it out, anybody else can too. It's not, to my mind, when we hear policymakers or law enforcement cite jurisdictional complexity as like the reason for this crisis or the reason that cases aren't solved, that's laughable. Because it's not that complicated. And also if it's so complicated that even law enforcement that we've decided are competent to uphold law and order in our communities can't figure it out, then they're really not that competent if they don't know where their jurisdiction starts and ends. If you're still wanting more of a kind of like resource on jurisdiction, I would recommend the 2 Indian law books for anyone who is kind of learning from the beginning, is Stephen Pivar's book called The Rights of Indians and Tribes, and then Walter Echohawk's book, In the Courts of the Conqueror, which is about specific legal cases that kind of set precedents for Indian country that were negative. Also, our organizing toolkit, just to plug it one more time, has a jurisdiction flowchart. That goes over this, but also like, what if it happens in a national park? What if it happens on the freeway? Like all these kinds of scenarios. What if the case crosses state lines? All of the kinds of things that you have to consider in any case, regardless of the race of the victim, are also included there too.
Thank you.
I think there's a question back here.
First of all, I want to tell you how I'm just really honored to be in a room with you. And I found out about you about 5 years ago when we first started looking at the database. And I just want to thank you for everything and thank you people and your ancestors for putting you here with us and everything that you're doing. And this example that you're studying for the rest of Indian country on how we can actually heal and make a difference. And the idea that you're working for an organization that's led by women is integral to almost every tribe's mentality and on where we came from. And so I just want to thank you for doing this. Thank you so much for leading. But I did have two questions. One was, if you could just do a quick definition in your mind of, because I've heard it, but if somebody asked me to give a definition of it, I wouldn't be able to.
Yeah.
The definition of Indigenous data sovereignty.
Our board member, Desi Rodriguez Lomber, is the person to ask. She's kind of foundational in the field, and she's the person who dragged me into it. She's also the reason SBI exists. I asked her like, hey, like, should we make this like a nonprofit? And she was like, yeah, I've already decided you're doing it. And she's, you know, like a very strong Northern Cheyenne and Chicana woman that like you do not say no to. So that's how all this happened. But in a nutshell, how I would define Indigenous data sovereignty is Indigenous people's inherent right to govern data about us and data collected for us.
Thank you. That's very beautiful. Thank you. And it's the beginning of reestablishing our sovereignty, isn't it?
Yeah.
Controlling the data. So I'm from Texas, and on my father's side, my tribe, we're from Texas. This is our ancestral homelands on my father's side. And I was really surprised, and I've seen that number before because I do work and support what Jody's doing down here, of course. That the only listed numbers of missing, and I personally don't like using the term Native American, so I say First Nations, even though I'm talking about my tribe here from the United States. There's only 33 First Nations women since 1907
I'm
in
positive
Texas.
it's way more than that.
And so is this a reflection on them ignoring that we're Indian, them not doing the data correctly? I have worked in the school district where the data has just been flat out. We've told them, well, this is an Indian child, and they're like, no, the child's last name is Rodriguez, so I know they're not Indian. So do you think that is what is reflective of these numbers in Texas? Because Texas is like a huge trafficking corridor. So there's got to be more missing,
Absolutely.
right?
And definitely more murder cases.
Yeah.
All of these numbers I'm confident are wrong. Every number we put out, but it's the number based on the data we have.
Yeah.
And you know, to kind of tie that back to the question about boarding schools, we include boarding school deaths in the data too. And so the number should absolutely be higher. I think the reason that the number is low for Texas is, I think one of the reasons is what you're saying, like this lack of recognition for indigeneity. Not only for like, you know, ignorant comments like, well, their last name is Rodriguez, but also like there's tribes in Texas that lack federal recognition. Like we work with Margot Temez, who's Lake Apache, and they lack federal recognition. And so if like she and I have talked about, because I'm a descendant, I'm not an enrolled tribal member, so she and I have talked about like the lack of recognition, both as a tribal member and, you know, from a tribe that's not recognized, what it would mean if one of us went missing or murdered, knowing that we probably wouldn't be documented as Indigenous. So that's definitely part of it. I think part of it too is that like states like Texas work so hard to erase any kind of Indigenous presence. Like
Texas is a kind of word. Texas is a
Yeah.
kind of word, yeah. But you're right, that's exactly what Texas is.
like they like to pretend that there were never any Native people here ever. Like I think Colorado is another really good example of that, where there are very few federally recognized tribes, and so they just kind of get to put their heads in the sand and pretend.
But what is really ironic about Texas is that at the end of the 2000 census, we had the 4th or 5th largest urban population. And that's why we have an IHL health center in Dallas, because North Texas had such a large population, and nobody knows that. you know?
I believe that. Well, and I believe that, like, you know, like you're saying with the educator that's like, oh, you know, their last name is Rodriguez, they can't possibly be Native. Police are saying the same thing.
Yeah.
And so that's part of it. And I think that there's a really large number of Indigenous folks here who get classified as Hispanic instead. And, or even worse, white. And I think part of it too is that, like, there's just like, even from a contemporary point of view, when a case happens now in a, like, because the media coverage of this issue has been so focused on places like Montana or Arizona, places like Texas or California just get completely left out of the narrative. Doesn't matter that they have a high number of cases, doesn't matter that they have big Indigenous populations, because they're not where white people expect Native people to be. And so they don't get coverage. And so cases happen and we don't know about it because it's not being reported on in the media. Police aren't putting flyers out, and there's no kind of broader awareness without groups like Jody. And that's something that, like, you know, with people like Jody is starting to change, but I think that's why our data in Texas is so poor.
Thank you. Thank you for everything.
We have a couple more questions online, then we'll wrap, 5 minutes, okay? And then we'll wrap at 8:30. So one
I can keep
question.
going, I got this.
We have a lot of questions live, but we won't get to all of them. Sorry, everyone. But one is, are there any examples of non-Native organizations who do an especially good job of understanding or responding to MMIW, G2S, who might be models for others helping to work in solidarity and support Native activism?
I mean, I'm sure there are. I'm trying to think of examples that I know. I will say there are other organizations led by other communities of color that have done a great job of standing in solidarity and working together. And the example that I would give is where our office is in California. There was a case of a Black college student who was murdered at a party. He was beaten to death. There was like 50 witnesses. This was a couple of years ago. Never got any justice, no convictions. And the people who were responsible were white supremacists. And so there's a big movement for justice for Josiah, and his mom has been really active in pushing for that. But his mom really intentionally reached out to us and said, like, hey, I see that your community is also experiencing murder at high rates and also not getting justice, and it's not okay. And, you know, Josiah would want to support your organization and your work too. Like, Justice for Josiah is bigger than just him. It's, you know, supporting all victims of racial violence. And so she's been really supportive to us, and, you know, vice versa. We have clients of ours who live in that area who are MMIW family members, especially moms. They'll go and support his mom at marches and rallies for Josiah. And they're in the process of a billboard campaign for Justice for Josiah, and reached out to us, and we donated to help cover the cost of the billboard. And they're putting our logo on the billboard and amplifying MMIW. So there's definitely experiences like that that have been really awesome. In terms of, like, I feel like non-Native gets coded for white. So I'm trying to think of like a white-led organization. That's a little harder to think of, to be honest. We do have clients at, like, for example, where I work in Montana, the only domestic violence shelters are led by YWCA. And they've done a pretty good job of taking in some of our clients and providing them long-term transitional housing. But that's largely because they have Native women staff members. So hopefully those are some encouraging examples. I do think there's room to grow. I would love to see those partnerships happen and flourish, but I don't have a ton of examples.
Sure. And then, speaking of growth, one last question from here, and then if there are any final questions in the room, how do you think Sovereign Bodies Institute will grow in the coming years?
Man, I didn't think Sovereign Bodies Institute would exist 3 years ago. And now we're a staff of 13, and I didn't think that would happen 6 months ago. So it's hard to even imagine how much we're going to grow or how things might change. One dream that we've put out there is that we would love to grow to be fully international with offices in multiple continents. And we recently hired, I don't know how recent, it was like March, but we hired someone who's from an Indigenous people in the Philippines. And they've been working to build our relationships with Polynesian Indigenous folks so that we can start working across the Pacific as well. And we work with, like, we have partners, Indigenous women in Kenya, Indigenous women throughout Latin America. So we would love to see those systems of kinship really grow. And I think that's, you know, as executive director, that's my dream.
Any final questions from the room? Well, then please help me in. Thank you. I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you to everyone who's online. And we'll have some of these resources posted. They're in the chat, and we'll make sure that they're also posted on our website as well. Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks for sticking it out late too.
Yeah, please, we have one more event at tomorrow night at 7 p.m. 6:30 p.m. Which is going to be a conversation. You've heard the name Jody mentioned a few times. Jody Voice Yellowfish from MMIW Texas Rematriate, and some tribal leaders are going to be. There's a change in lineup, but they're going to be having a conversation about tribal roles in tribal leadership roles in addressing MMIW. So that's online. We hope you'll join us there.